Sometime in the spring of 1969, a letter mailed from New York City to an address in Moscow was intercepted before it reached the postal sorting facility. It was steamed open at a facility in a lower Manhattan building where a small team worked in a room that did not appear on any organizational chart and processed approximately 2,000 pieces of mail per month. The contents were photographed. The envelope was resealed. The letter was returned to the postal stream and eventually delivered to its recipient as though nothing had happened. The person who wrote it never knew. Neither did any federal judge. No court had authorized the interception. No warrant had been sought. The operation ran for 21 years, photographed the mail of approximately 215,000 Americans, and produced a watch list that at various points included sitting United States senators, a former Secretary of State, and a scientist named Linus Pauling, who had won 2 Nobel Prizes and who the Central Intelligence Agency considered a security risk because of his public opposition to nuclear weapons testing. The operation was called HTLINGUAL. It was not the agency's only domestic program. It was not the most aggressive one. It was just the one that happened to have the most paper, which is how we know about it, because in 1973, when the CIA's director ordered certain programs destroyed, HTLINGUAL's records were substantial enough and distributed enough across enough different file classifications that they could not all be found. What survived went to the Senate. What the Senate found there took investigators months to process and produced a report that the sitting CIA director described privately as catastrophic. The scale of what the investigators uncovered was not the kind of thing that fits easily into a summary. It required 14 volumes. It named names. It quoted internal memoranda in which senior officials discussed the legal exposure of programs they were simultaneously authorizing and, in some cases, expanding. It described an intelligence community that had, over the course of nearly 3 decades, developed a working theory of its own authority that bore very little relationship to the legal framework Congress had created when it established the CIA in 1947, and that had operationalized that theory against American citizens in ways that no elected official had approved and that most of them had not known about. The Central Intelligence Agency was created by the National Security Act of 1947. The act was specific about one thing. In a way, it was not specific about very many things. The CIA was prohibited from exercising police, subpoena, or law enforcement powers, and from conducting internal security functions inside the United States. Those were the FBI's responsibilities. The CIA's mandate was foreign intelligence. What happened between 1947 and 1974 is the story of an agency that read its charter the way a man reads a contract he intends to sign but not honor, finding in the language's ambiguities enough space to build, over the course of 2.5 decades, a domestic surveillance apparatus that monitored American citizens at a scale and with a disregard for legal authority that its own internal reviews, conducted years later, could not fully explain. The people who ran these programs were not reckless. Most of them were precise, institutionally careful men who believed what they were doing was necessary. That is a more uncomfortable fact than the alternative, which would be that the programs were the work of obvious criminals operating outside any institutional logic. They were not. They were the work of an institution operating inside its own logic, in a context where external accountability did not exist, and the distinction matters because it tells you something important about how surveillance states are actually built. They are not built by villains who announce their intentions. They are built by careful men who believe the threat is real, who have been given tools and a mandate and no one standing over their shoulder, and who make decisions in that vacuum that they would not make if the vacuum did not exist. Understanding that is the only way to understand how what follows was possible inside a country that had a Bill of Rights and a free press and a Congress with subpoena power and still managed to let it run for 20 years before anyone outside the building knew it was happening. The pressure that produced Operation Chaos, the CIA's most extensive domestic surveillance program, came directly from the White House. By 1967, the Johnson administration was consumed by a single question: who was organizing the anti-war movement, and were they receiving direction or money from foreign communist sources? The question was not unreasonable on its face. The Cold War context made foreign manipulation of domestic dissent a genuine intelligence concern, not a paranoid invention. Soviet active measures programs had been attempting to influence Western public opinion since the 1940s. The KGB ran agents in Western European peace movements. The possibility that similar operations were targeting the American left was not a fantasy. What made the question unreasonable in this specific case was the answer the CIA kept producing and the White House kept refusing to accept. The CIA's foreign intelligence assets had examined the anti-war movement repeatedly and found no evidence of significant Soviet or Chinese operational direction. The movement was domestic. It was driven by domestic grievances about a domestic policy being prosecuted with American lives on terrain 10,000 miles away for objectives that the men being sent to die they were not always able to articulate. That answer was delivered to the White House multiple times. The White House sent the question back each time, effectively saying, "Look harder." In August of 1967, CIA Director Richard Helms assigned the task of looking harder to a counterintelligence officer named Richard Ober, who was given a staff, a budget, and an assignment to determine the extent of foreign influence on domestic dissent. Ober called his operation Chaos. He was not being ironic. Ober was a methodical man. He built chaos the way a careful bureaucrat builds anything, file by file, contact by contact, index card by index card, until the operation had a physical architecture that expressed his institutional thoroughness. The program established a computerized database, one of the first in the agency's history, that by 1974 contained files on 7,200 American citizens and cross-reference files on approximately 100 additional domestic organizations. The organizations included Students for a Democratic Society, the Black Panther Party, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Women's Strike for Peace, and a range of smaller anti-war and civil rights groups that the program treated as potential vectors of foreign influence. Chaos. Officers recruited informants inside these organizations. They worked with FBI field offices to share intelligence. They sent officers abroad undercover to penetrate foreign contacts of domestic organizations. They collected reporting on Americans who attended international conferences, Americans who visited Cuba or North Vietnam, Americans who corresponded with foreign nationals in ways the program considered suspicious. The information went into the database. The database grew. The foreign direction that Chaos had been created to find did not materialize in the data because it was not there. The operation continued regardless. By the time it was shut down in 1974, Chaos had cost the agency approximately $2 million, employed dozens of officers across multiple stations, and produced 0 confirmed cases of Soviet or Chinese operational control of the American anti-war movement. What it had produced was 7,200 files on American citizens who had not been charged with any crime. The specific contents of those files varied, but their existence followed a consistent logic. A person appeared in the chaos database because they had done something that brought them to the attention of an informant, or a liaison contact, or a signals intercept, or a mail intercept. And once they appeared in the database, they stayed there, because the program had no mechanism for removing people whose presence in the files had proved uninformative. Files accumulated, cross-references multiplied. A person who had attended a single anti-war rally in 1967, and a person who had traveled to Havana on a press credential, and a person who had written a letter to a Soviet cultural organization inquiring about an exchange program all occupied the same database, filed under the same broad category of domestic dissent, available for retrieval by any officer with access to the system. The database did not distinguish between levels of concern. It simply collected. The mail opening program predated chaos by more than a decade. HTLINGUAL began in 1952, 2 years before Ober joined the agency, and it operated out of a mailroom in New York that the CIA maintained through a cover arrangement with the Postal Service's Security Division. The cover arrangement was exactly that, a cover. The Postal Service officials who cooperated with the program understood that they were not to discuss it, and the CIA officers who ran it understood that its legal basis was, at best, a creative interpretation of authorities that had never been tested in court and that would almost certainly not survive such a test if anyone ever brought one. No one did for 21 years because no one outside a very small circle knew the program existed. The operation had 2 components. The first was a watch list of individuals whose mail was to be intercepted and examined whenever it passed through the New York facility on its way to or from the Soviet Union. The second was a random sampling program that photographed exterior envelope information from a much larger volume of mail, building a database of correspondence patterns between American and Soviet addresses that the agency's counterintelligence division considered analytically useful. The watch list grew over 21 years to include a range of figures that, when it became public in 1975, struck the Senate investigators examining it as difficult to reconcile with any coherent definition of national security threat. Senator Frank Church, the Idaho Democrat who chaired the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, read some of the names into the record at the committee's hearings. They included Senators Edward Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey, former Secretary of State Christian Herter, the author John Steinbeck, and the physicist Linus Pauling. Pauling had signed petitions opposing nuclear testing and had corresponded with Soviet scientists about arms control. The CIA considered him a person of interest. It photographed his mail for years. He never knew. The watch list also included, at various points, prominent journalists, academic researchers who studied Soviet affairs, lawyers who had represented clients in cases with national security dimensions, and clergy who had corresponded with religious organizations in communist countries. The common thread was not subversion. It was contact, any contact, with the Soviet Union or its citizens, filtered through an analytical framework that treated correspondence itself as a marker of potential concern. In that framework, a historian who wrote to a Soviet archivist requesting access to documents and a KGB agent running an active intelligence operation against American targets occupied the same category, which was person who communicates with Soviets. The framework had no gradations. It had only the list. The coordination between the CIA and the FBI on domestic surveillance was the program's most legally significant dimension because it connected two institutions with overlapping but legally distinct mandates in ways that blurred the line between foreign intelligence and domestic law enforcement, in ways that neither institution had clear authority to blur. The FBI ran COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program that targeted domestic political organizations from 1956 to 1971, and that the Senate Church Committee would later describe as a program that had used every tool available to disrupt, discredit, and in some cases destroy the organizations it considered threats. COINTELPRO's tools included anonymous letters sent to targets' employers, spouses, and landlords containing fabricated accusations. It included the creation of forged documents designed to inflame tensions between rival organizations. It included the placement of informants at the highest levels of targeted groups, informants who in some cases encouraged illegal activity in order to create grounds for prosecution. It included a campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. that the FBI's own internal documents described as an effort to neutralize him as a civil rights leader, a campaign that involved wiretapping his hotel rooms, sending him anonymous letters that FBI officials later acknowledged were intended to drive him to suicide, and attempting to prevent him from receiving the Nobel Peace Prize by providing derogatory information about him to the Norwegian government. The CIA had its own separate files on King, assembled partly through chaos and partly through HTLINGUAL, which had photographed his correspondence. The two agencies shared information regularly. They did so through informal liaison channels that left minimal documentation, which was the point. Formal coordination would have required formal authorization. Informal coordination required nothing except a phone call between officers who knew each other and understood that certain conversations did not get written down. The document that eventually forced chaos and HTLINGUAL into public view was called the Family Jewels, and its creation was itself a product of institutional anxiety rather than institutional conscience. In May of 1973, CIA Director James Schlesinger, who had been brought in by the Nixon White House to bring discipline to an agency it considered unreliable, sent a directive to all CIA components requiring them to report to him any activities that might be inconsistent with the agency's charter. Schlesinger had been prompted by public reporting about the CIA's involvement in the Watergate break-in and related operations, specifically the use of former CIA officers in the plumbers unit that had broken into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office and the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex, and he wanted to know what else was out there before someone else found it. The response came back in a document 693 pages long, covering activities that included assassination plots against foreign leaders, domestic mail opening, surveillance of American citizens, illegal break-ins, the testing of drugs on unwitting subjects, and the use of agency assets in domestic political operations that had nothing to do with foreign intelligence. Schlesinger ordered the document classified at the highest level and locked it away. He left the CIA 6 weeks after receiving it, departing for the Defense Department. His successor, William Colby, inherited the document and spent the next year and a half sitting on it, while the political environment around him deteriorated in ways that made its eventual exposure increasingly certain. When the New York Times published Seymour Hersh's December 1974 story about CIA domestic surveillance, Colby faced a decision about how much to tell Congress. He decided, against the strong preference of most of his senior staff and of former directors, including Richard Helms, to cooperate with the congressional investigations that followed. He eventually provided the family jewels to the Senate investigators. His colleagues never forgave him for it. They called him, in the language their world used for such things, a suicide bomber. He had blown up the house to save his own conscience, and the people still inside it had not been consulted. If you want to understand why the Church Committee's findings read the way they do, with that particular quality of controlled alarm that career Senate staffers produce when they have found something they cannot quite believe, hit subscribe and keep watching. Because what comes next is where the specific names and the specific operations and the specific decisions come together in a way that makes the abstract arguments about oversight and accountability very concrete and very hard to dismiss as the inevitable product of a different era's threat environment. The Church Committee formally convened in January of 1975 under the chairmanship of Senator Frank Church of Idaho, a Democrat who was also, as his critics on the Republican side of the committee frequently noted, considering a run for the 1976 presidential nomination. The criticism was fair as a political observation and irrelevant as an analytical one. The documents the committee examined were what they were, regardless of Church's ambitions, and what they were was a detailed record of an intelligence community that had operated for nearly 3 decades with no meaningful external accountability and had used that absence to conduct operations against American citizens that no court had authorized, and that the agencies themselves, in the most candid of their internal reviews, acknowledged had no clear legal basis. The committee had 11 members, 6 Democrats and 5 Republicans, and it operated with a staff of approximately 150 investigators and lawyers who spent most of 1975 reading through classified files, interviewing current and former intelligence officials, and attempting to construct a coherent picture of an institutional history that had been deliberately fragmented across compartmented programs and informal channels, specifically to prevent anyone from constructing that picture. The staff worked in secure facilities. They carried documents in locked cases. Several of them later said the experience of reading through the files had changed their understanding of what the American government was, not in a partisan sense, but in a structural one. They had believed, before they started, that the laws governing government conduct were more or less followed because the alternative was too obviously dangerous to contemplate. The files told a different story. The committee's final report, published in April of 1976, ran to 14 volumes. Volume 3, covering domestic CIA and FBI activities, was the one that received the most public attention. It described chaos in detail, described HTLINGUAL in detail, described the FBI's COINTELPRO in detail, and drew conclusions about the relationship between those programs and American constitutional law that were not ambiguous. The agencies had violated the law. The violations had been systematic. They had been known to senior officials. They had been concealed from Congress. The CIA's specific response to Operation Chaos in the years between 1967 and its shutdown in 1974 illustrated something about how institutional programs sustain themselves past the point where they are producing anything useful. The program's own analysts, in internal assessments conducted in 1969 and again in 1971, concluded that the available evidence did not support the foreign control hypothesis. The 1969 assessment said directly that the anti-war movement was substantially a domestic phenomenon driven by domestic concerns. The 1971 assessment reached the same conclusion with even greater specificity, noting that the analytical returns from the program had not improved despite the expansion of its collection activities, and that continued investment was unlikely to change that finding. Both assessments were delivered to the White House. The Nixon administration, which by 1969 had replaced the Johnson administration as the program's primary client, received the assessments and continued to request expanded coverage. Nixon's senior staff, particularly H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, wanted more intelligence on domestic political opponents, and the categories of concern expanded steadily from foreign influence on anti-war groups to surveillance of political figures who could not, by any reasonable interpretation, be described as foreign intelligence targets. Tom Charles Houston, a White House aide in his late 20s who had been an officer in the Army's intelligence branch, drafted a plan in June of 1970 that proposed a formal interagency domestic intelligence program combining CIA, FBI, NSA, and military intelligence resources under White House coordination. The Houston Plan proposed resuming mail opening that had technically been suspended, expanding electronic surveillance, conducting surreptitious entries into domestic targets, and monitoring American citizens studying abroad. Nixon approved it. J. Edgar Hoover, who had been running the FBI since 1924 and who understood institutional risk better than anyone in Washington, refused to implement it. He was not refusing on principle. Hoover had run COINTELPRO for 15 years and had approved operations against American citizens that were far more aggressive than anything the Houston Plan proposed. He refused because he wanted the authorization in writing, personally signed by the president, so that if the program was ever exposed, the liability would rest with the White House rather than with him. The White House was not willing to create that paper trail. The written authorization was not provided. The Houston Plan was formally rescinded 5 days after Nixon signed it. The informal equivalence continued through other channels, through the CIA's existing chaos operation, through FBI field offices running their own programs under COINTELPRO authorities, and through the military intelligence apparatus that had been conducting its own domestic surveillance of anti-war groups since at least 1967, and that the Church Committee would later document in a separate section of its final report. Richard Ober ran chaos until 1974. He was a career counterintelligence officer who believed he was doing necessary work and who, in the internal assessments he wrote about the program, expressed genuine conviction that the foreign influence question warranted the investigation he was conducting. He was not a sadist. He was not corrupt in any personal financial sense. He was an institutional man who had been given a mission, had built the tools to execute it, and had continued executing it past the point where the evidence supported the premise, because stopping would have required him to tell superiors that the program was producing nothing actionable, and intelligence programs that produce nothing actionable do not receive continued budget allocations. The people who made budget decisions about chaos were not people who had read the 1969 and 1971 analytical assessments that said the program was not finding what it was looking for. They were people who had been told that the program existed, that it was producing reporting, and that the threat environment justified its continuation. The reporting it was producing was real, in the sense that it described real people and real activities. It was uninformative in the sense that it did not answer the question the program had been created to answer, which was whether foreign communist governments were directing the American anti-war movement. That distinction was not visible from the budget office. The 7,200 Americans in the chaos database had no idea their files existed. They bore the cost of the program's continuation without any voice in the question of whether it should continue. That asymmetry was not incidental to the program's design. It was the program's design. The mail opening operation ended in 1973, terminated by CIA Director Colby after the Watergate investigations began creating pressure that made the program's exposure a realistic near-term possibility. By that point, HTLINGUAL had photographed approximately 215,000 pieces of mail and opened and read the contents of approximately 28,000 of them over 21 years. The watch list had included at its peak more than 600 names. The analytical product derived from the operation had, by the assessment of CIA counterintelligence officers who reviewed it in 1975, produced limited intelligence value that did not justify the program's duration. This was the CIA's own post-hoc evaluation. It was delivered internally and classified. The people whose mail had been read were not informed. The Postal Service employees who had cooperated with the program were not publicly identified. The program simply stopped, and its records were incorporated into the Family Jewels document, and for 2 years, nothing happened. What happened in December of 1974 was Seymour Hersh. The New York Times reporter had been working sources inside the intelligence community for months and had assembled a story that described the CIA's domestic surveillance activities in enough specific detail that the agency could not dismiss it as speculation. Hersh's story ran on December 22, 1974, above the fold on the front page of the Times, under a headline that said, "The CIA had conducted a massive illegal domestic intelligence operation during the Nixon years against the anti-war movement and other dissident groups." The story was not complete in its details, some of which were still classified at levels Hersh had not reached, but it was accurate in its essential claims, and it landed on a Washington political environment that had been sensitized by Watergate to exactly the kind of story Hersh was telling, a secret government program run without external accountability used against American citizens for political purposes. The response from Congress was immediate. Within weeks, both chambers had initiated investigations. By January of 1975, the Church Committee in the Senate and the Pike Committee in the House were formally convened, and William Colby was preparing to do what his predecessors had never contemplated, which was to hand congressional investigators access to the agency's most sensitive operational files. Colby's decision to cooperate was not without calculation. He believed that the Church Committee would eventually get what it wanted, regardless of CIA resistance, and that a posture of cooperation would give the agency more control over how the information was released than a posture of obstruction would. He was also, in some accounts from people who worked with him, genuinely troubled by what the family jewels contained. Colby was a Catholic who had served in the OSS in World War II, had run the CIA's Phoenix program in Vietnam, a program that had resulted in the killing of tens of thousands of suspected Viet Cong operatives by South Vietnamese security forces, and who had given congressional testimony about Phoenix in 1971 that had been more candid than his agency considered appropriate. He had a pattern of telling things he was not supposed to tell, and he told them again in 1975. Richard Helms, who had ordered the MK Ultra files destroyed in 1973 and who was deeply invested in the proposition that CIA operational secrets were not congressional business, regarded Colby's cooperation with the Church Committee as a betrayal at an institutional level that was close to unforgivable. Helms testified before the committee himself in September of 1975. He was careful, precise, and in several specific instances, inaccurate in ways that later resulted in a criminal referral for perjury, to which he eventually pleaded no contest in 1977 and paid a fine of $2,000. He did not go to jail. No one connected to chaos or HTLINGUAL went to jail. No officer who had recruited informants inside domestic political organizations was charged with any crime. No Postal Service official who had facilitated 21 years of warrantless mail interception faced any legal consequence. The Church Committee's final conclusions were structured carefully to avoid the appearance of attacking the intelligence community as an institution, while making clear that the specific conduct it had documented was indefensible. The committee framed its criticism in terms of inadequate oversight rather than institutional malice, arguing that the agencies had operated in a vacuum that made abuse not just possible, but predictable. The Watergate parallel was implicit throughout the report and explicit in several of Church's public statements during the investigation. The same conditions that produced a president who believed he could authorize illegal domestic operations had produced intelligence agencies that believed they could conduct illegal domestic surveillance. The condition was the same: the absence of any institutional mechanism that could say no and make it stick. The reforms that followed the Church Committee were substantial and real. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, enacted in 1978, created a specialized federal court to authorize electronic surveillance and physical searches in intelligence investigations involving foreign powers and their agents, establishing for the first time a judicial check on intelligence collection targeting persons inside the United States. The Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence in the Senate and the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence in the House gave Congress ongoing oversight mechanisms for the intelligence community that the Church Committee had found entirely lacking. Executive Order 11,905, signed by President Gerald Ford in February of 1976, and its successor orders under Carter and Reagan, formalized restrictions on CIA domestic activities and prohibited the assassination of foreign leaders. These were real constraints built by people who had read the family jewels and understood what the absence of constraints had produced. The question of whether the constraints were sufficient was one that subsequent decades continued to test, because the technology available to intelligence agencies changed in ways that the legal framework designed in 1978 was not built to address, and because the institutional pressures that had produced chaos and HTLINGUAL did not disappear when the Church Committee published its report. They went dormant. They waited for a threat environment severe enough to make the arguments for bypassing oversight seem reasonable again to the people with the authority to bypass it. The architecture of surveillance that HTLINGUAL had built with steam kettles and cameras in a lower Manhattan mailroom became, in a different technological context, something with capabilities the men who ran chaos in 1969 could not have imagined, and the legal and institutional frameworks that were supposed to govern that architecture were tested in ways that the Church Committee's authors, for all their thoroughness, had not been able to fully anticipate. The question they had been unable to fully answer, which was whether democratic institutions could maintain effective accountability over secret intelligence programs in real time rather than discovering their excesses 20 years after the fact, remained open then. It remains open now. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next episode in this series goes further into what the Church Committee could not reach, the programs that survived the hearings intact because their records had been destroyed before the investigators arrived, and the men who destroyed them, what they knew and what they believed they were protecting.